The moment these new records surfaced, the internet exploded with one terrifying question. Did Prince Andrew know far more about Jeffrey Epstein than anyone ever admitted? And was Sarah Ferguson somehow tangled deep inside the same web? Because the emails now circulating aren't just awkward, they're explosive. They suggest something far darker, far stranger, and far more uncomfortable than the public was ever supposed to see. For years, the Epstein scandal has been a sprawling nightmare of money, power, and secrets hidden behind elite doors. Billionaires, politicians, celebrities, royal connections. Every time the public thinks the story has reached its limit, another file appears, and suddenly the entire narrative twists again. And this time, the twist drags Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, directly into the center of the storm. According to newly surfaced documents, Ferguson wasn't just casually acquainted with Jeffrey Epstein. The emails paint a completely different picture, one that feels disturbingly intimate. In one message, she describes Epstein as the brother I always wished for. That alone raised eyebrows across the internet, but what came next pushed the scandal into an entirely new level of speculation, because buried inside those emails was something that made investigators stop cold. A congratulatory message. A message sent to Jeffrey Epstein celebrating the birth of a baby boy. Yes, a baby. And the timing of that email is what makes everything feel deeply unsettling. This message wasn't written during Epstein's early days when his reputation still appeared respectable. It came after the accusations, after the criminal case, after the plea deal, after the world already knew exactly what kind of man he was. So why would Sarah Ferguson be congratulating him on fatherhood at that point? That single message has unleashed a storm of speculation that refuses to quiet down, because people online are no longer just talking about friendship. They're whispering about something much darker, a possibility that Epstein may have had a secret child hidden completely from public view. And if that's true, then why was Ferguson involved in the conversation about that child at all? Did she simply know about it, or was she somehow closer to the situation than anyone realized? And that's where the story becomes even more complicated, because the moment you pull on that thread, another name immediately appears: Prince Andrew. Andrew's connection to Epstein has already been dissected endlessly over the years. Photographs, flights, visits, dinners, statements that never quite matched the timelines, his infamous television interview that only made things worse, the royal scandal that refused to disappear. But the emails suggest something people hadn't fully processed before. Sarah Ferguson may have been one of the people keeping the Epstein connection alive behind the scenes. And if that's true, it raises a terrifying possibility. What if this wasn't just Andrew making bad choices? What if the entire dynamic between Andrew, Ferguson, and Epstein was far more intertwined than anyone understood? The internet certainly thinks so. Public reaction has been savage. Brutal comments flooded social media within hours of the documents appearing. People accused Ferguson of chasing money, protecting power, and ignoring morality entirely. One furious commenter summarized the anger in a single devastating line: anything for money, even if it costs your own family. That harsh reaction didn't come from nowhere, because when people started reading deeper into those emails, they realized something else was happening behind the scenes. The messages weren't just affectionate, they were financial. At one point, Ferguson reportedly wrote to Epstein in a moment of panic, saying she urgently needed $20,000 to pay her rent. The situation sounded desperate. Her landlord was threatening to expose her situation to the press if the money didn't appear quickly. And Epstein's response? It wasn't simply sympathy. Instead, he began discussing how the story might leak, how it might affect investors, and how it should be handled publicly if journalists discovered the situation. That kind of conversation doesn't sound like a casual loan between friends. It sounds like crisis management, which leads to another disturbing question people are now asking. If Epstein was financially supporting Ferguson, what exactly was he receiving in return? Because the deeper investigators read into the correspondence, the stranger the tone became. One email exchange even included Ferguson joking about her teenage daughter's shagging weekend while speaking with Epstein, a comment that made readers physically recoil once they realized who the message was being sent to. The moment that detail surfaced, public opinion shifted from curiosity to outright horror. Why would a mother speak about her daughter like that to a man who had already been accused of exploiting underage girls? For many observers, that single message crossed a line that could never be explained away. And yet the most explosive details still circled back to that mysterious baby. The congratulatory message Ferguson sent to Epstein continues to haunt the entire conversation. Because if Epstein truly had a child at that time, the timeline would place that boy somewhere around 14 years old today. A teenager, old enough now to start asking questions. And here's the part that made investigators pause. According to the documents, Ferguson may have first heard about the baby from Prince Andrew himself, which immediately triggered a new wave of speculation. If Andrew and Ferguson were truly divorced and living separate lives, why were they still so deeply entangled in the same circle of secrets? For years, their relationship had always seemed unusual. They divorced in the 1990s, yet continued living together, vacationing together, appearing publicly supportive of each other. Many people described them as a divorced couple who never really separated. Now, some observers believe that strange dynamic may have been hiding something far more complicated. Because if Andrew knew about Epstein's secret child, and Ferguson knew because Andrew told her, then the question becomes impossible to ignore. How deeply involved were they really? The speculation online has spiraled into theories that range from uncomfortable to outright shocking. Some people believe Andrew and Ferguson maintained an unofficial arrangement, a quiet understanding that allowed certain relationships to remain hidden behind carefully constructed public stories. Others point to the years Andrew spent serving in the Royal Navy as a convenient explanation for long absences that were never examined too closely. And then there's the darkest theory of all, that Epstein wasn't just a friend. He was a financial lifeline. For years, Ferguson had struggled with money. Business deals collapsed. Debt piled up. Headlines about financial trouble followed her constantly. If Epstein was quietly helping fund her lifestyle, critics argue that she had every reason to keep that relationship alive, even if it meant pulling Andrew deeper into Epstein's orbit. It's a theory that may sound extreme, but Epstein's own emails only seem to make the situation stranger. In one message, he allegedly wrote something astonishing. He suggested that Ferguson could now publicly say he wasn't what people were calling him. He even referenced the word pedo. That moment left readers stunned, because the conversation wasn't about whether Epstein had been accused. The conversation was about managing the accusation, managing the narrative, protecting reputations. And once that pattern appears inside these emails, it becomes very difficult to ignore the possibility that powerful people were quietly working together to reshape the public story. Then another message appeared, and this one may be the most revealing of all. In it, Ferguson reportedly explained that she never used that word about Epstein because she was trying to protect her own brand. Protect her brand. Those three words detonated across the internet like a bomb, because the moment people read them, sympathy disappeared almost instantly. Critics said it sounded less like regret and more like damage control, as if the real concern wasn't Epstein's crimes but how association with him might affect her image. And that's when the entire scandal began to feel bigger than one email, or one friendship, or even one royal figure. Because once you step back and look at the whole picture, the money, the loyalty, the strange affection, the attempts to manage the narrative, it starts to resemble something far more troubling. A system, a network, a web of powerful individuals quietly protecting each other while the world outside tried to understand what was happening. And right in the middle of that web sits the uncomfortable question no one inside the palace has ever fully answered. How much did Prince Andrew actually know? And the deeper investigators dig into these files, the more impossible it becomes to accept the idea that Prince Andrew was simply an innocent bystander drifting through the orbit of a dangerous man. Because every layer of this scandal seems to pull his name back into the center of the storm again and again and again. For years, Andrew insisted the same story whenever the Epstein question resurfaced. He claimed their relationship ended long before the public truly understood who Epstein was. He insisted he cut ties early, stepped away, and moved on with his life. That explanation became the official line repeated across interviews, statements, and palace responses. But the problem with carefully constructed narratives is that they rarely survive the release of real documents. And these files, they don't match Andrew's story. Emails, invitations, meeting references, Andrew's name appears repeatedly even after Epstein's criminal conviction had already shocked the world. The timeline refuses to cooperate with the version Andrew presented publicly. The connections seem to stretch further and later than he ever admitted. And once people realized that, something shifted. The question was no longer whether Andrew knew Epstein. The question became far more uncomfortable. Why did he keep going back? Because the truth is, Epstein's crimes were not some hidden rumor whispered in elite circles. By the time Andrew was still appearing in Epstein's world, the accusations were already public. The plea deal had already happened. The disturbing allegations about young girls had already circulated through headlines, yet somehow the connection remained alive. Even photographs began resurfacing that only deepened the sense that Andrew had been far closer to Epstein's world than anyone wanted to admit. In one strange image circulating from the files, Andrew appears on all fours above a woman lying beneath him. The woman is clothed, the situation technically ambiguous, but the posture alone made people uneasy the moment it surfaced. And then there's the detail that truly disturbed investigators. In one photo, Andrew is looking directly into the camera while positioned over the woman, his hands touching her stomach. No crime proven, no direct accusation attached to the image, but the optics were disastrous. Because once an individual is connected to a scandal like Epstein's, every strange photograph suddenly looks suspicious. Every unexplained interaction begins to feel sinister. And the deeper the files go, the stranger the invitations become. One email reportedly shows Epstein arranging dinner for Andrew with a 26-year-old Russian woman in August 2010. This meeting would have taken place 2 years after Epstein had already pleaded guilty to soliciting a minor. Think about that timeline carefully. 2 full years after the world knew. 2 full years after Epstein's crimes became undeniable. undeniable. And still, the invitations continued. For critics, that detail alone shredded Andrew's defense that he had already distanced himself. If the relationship had truly ended earlier, why was Epstein still arranging meetings, dinners, introductions? Why was Andrew still appearing inside that social circle at all? That contradiction is exactly why the public conversation has become so ruthless. People aren't simply debating mistakes anymore. They're questioning judgment, loyalty, and the willingness to overlook something monstrous for the sake of comfort and privilege. And every time another file surfaces, the world is reminded that behind the glittering image of royalty and wealth, there may exist a far darker reality, one built on silence, protection, and the quiet understanding that some people are simply too powerful to ever face the full weight of accountability. That's why the Epstein files continue haunting headlines long after his death. Because they don't just expose one man's crimes, they expose the world that allowed him to operate. A world where billionaires, celebrities, and even members of royalty could stand close to the fire, yet somehow walk away without getting burned. And as long as those unanswered questions remain floating around Prince Andrew, Sarah Ferguson, and their strange connection to Epstein, the scandal refuses to fade into history. Instead, it lingers like a shadow over the palace walls, a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing secrets aren't hidden in dark alleys or criminal hideouts. Sometimes they sit quietly inside the most powerful institutions on earth, and the truth behind them may still be waiting to surface.